Buongiorno, mondo, and welcome back to 15 with Fauska, the podcast. I'm delighted to be here today with Julia Curtis, who is Zooming with us here from Venice. Ciao, Julia.
Ciao, buongiorno, buongiorno. Grazie.
It's so nice to have you here on the podcast today. And as I often do, what I would like to do is start with your story of
Okay.
how you got to Venice, Italy from Berkeley, California.
Right.
And just let's start with that. Why, why are you here? Why are you in Venice with that beautiful picture of Venice behind you? So we will
Yeah.
have to do a video episode. Yeah.
I was painted by a friend of mine. That's actually the view that I have out the front window. That's San Giorgio di Maggiore, which is a church by Palladio. And maybe later in the podcast, I'll show you the real church.
Okay, that's beautiful.
Anyway, so my story, brevemente, is that I grew up in California, in Berkeley. My father was a music professor, and he was born on a small farm in the middle of nowhere in Michigan, but was a super musician. And when he was in university, he got a Fulbright scholarship in the 50s to come and study in Holland, Baroque music, and then basically in the 50s fell in love with Europe. So he was basically a wannabe Italian, had no Italian roots, but because he was a musician, Italy always spoke, directly to his heart. So my parents got divorced when I was young, and he basically, when he wasn't teaching every other semester at Berkeley, he was off performing somewhere in Europe. So as a kid, my time to spend with my dad was usually a few weeks in the summer wherever he was performing. So that meant I was really privileged and got to see a lot of Europe when I was young. And even actually, when I was, I think, 3 years old, we lived in Venice when he was doing some research for projects. So I lived here when I was 3 years old. Not that I particularly remember all those times, but it had a profound effect. I think somewhere like on the cellular level, I still feel like, part of my childhood was here. And ultimately, my decision to come back to Venice and to live in Venice now is actually because of my daughter, and because I think this is the safest city in the world to raise kids. So yeah, basically that's how I got introduced to Venice through my father, through his work as an opera director and conductor, and through his love of Italy, through the transverse property, I fell in love with Italy. And I went to graduate school at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And when I decided I wanted to go to graduate school, as an undergrad, I had studied both art history and political science. And at grad school, I was like, which world do I want to go in? And there's times where I feel like maybe I went in the wrong direction, because I still love art very much. And that's probably still a very big reason why I live in Venice. But I decided to go the political science, international relations, energy, environment policy route. And that's why I chose going to Johns Hopkins. And they had 1 year in Bologna, and then the second year of the master's in Washington, D.C. So that 1 year I had in Bologna was one of the best years of my life. And I studied with, students from probably 35 different countries. It was really an eye-opening experience. And it reinforced that Italy was a fantastic place, and that eventually this was like, on my list of places to live. So yeah, it's been a long kind of love affair with Italy. And here I am. So I've been here almost 10 years on and off with my daughter, who's 12 now. So she's pretty much grown up completely bilingual and in this fantastic, playground of a city.
Okay, so I have a ton of questions for you. First of all, I'm happy you talked a little bit about the Hopkins program, because it's a program that I often recommend, a program that I would recommend to former students, and that I still recommend, because I do think it's an excellent program.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that it's structured in such a way that a year is here and a year is in DC. And so I think that that's just already an incredibly rich thing.
Yeah, it is a fantastic program. So I'll tell you a little story about SAIS, which I'm pretty sure is true, which is it was started by Paul H. Nitze, who was a very important political figure in the 50s. And they have a program, obviously the head of the program is in Washington, D.C. and it's a 2-year master's. Everyone does a degree in international economics, and then you have a second sort of degree or concentration, which could be anything from American foreign policy, European affairs, defense, African studies, strategic studies, energy and environment, science and technology, which was my concentration. So that's like the academic side of the program. The story, the backstory of why Johns Hopkins did what it did is that it decided, hey, let's also offer a year abroad. So they started a program in Bologna, Italy, and they started a program in Nanjing, China. Now you kind of have to step back and realize Bologna was the bastion of communism, right? So for Southern Europe, maybe even for a lot of Europe, communism was really like boiling up in Bologna. And Paul Nitze had a very strong connection with the CIA. And I think there was definitely some like, hey, let's put an American campus in the middle of this communist bastion in Bologna and find out what's really going on.
Yeah.
So that is in fact what they did. And a lot of my classmates were recruited into the CIA. And a lot of other classmates who were not American, you know, like the Austrians, they have a program where they give scholarships to their students to come to SAIS Bologna because they're going into the foreign service. You know, so all these different countries kind of realize that this is a prime program if you want to do international relations, if you want to learn about international economics, if you want to be in an international setting. So yeah, I couldn't recommend the program more, with a few caveats. One is that it's super expensive. I was lucky enough to pretty much have a full scholarship for various reasons. And there are certain scholarships available. Two is that it is still a bit American or Western focused, even though you can have a degree in African studies or South Asian studies, but you know, let's face it, it's still an American institution.
Right.
And three is that if you don't like economics or you're not good at math, it's a challenge. And I put myself in that last category because I'm terrible at math. And it's kind of a miracle that I have a master's in economics. But it's, you know, it's a useful skill in life. Like,
Absolutely.
You know, it's, money makes the world go round, whether we like it or not. So
exactly. So I want to get back to your path because there's definitely some things that are missing. And so I want you to fill in some gaps for me. I know that you do many things and I'll let you talk about them, but I want to start with your consulting work, which you briefly mentioned at the beginning, because you do have a very rich, very long and rich experience with NGOs. You've worked with the UN. And so I want to talk a little bit more about your past work and your current work and what you do with your consulting. That's part one.
Okay.
And then part two is then, so you said you moved here permanently about 10 years ago. So I also want to hear about that transition as well. So there you.
All right, so I'll try to start chronologically just to make it a little bit more consistent. So from SAIS, I was recruited into what was then called the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, or intern program, PMI, which was basically like the headhunter of students from graduate school to go and be managers in the federal government. So, you know, I was like, should I do the Peace Corps? Should I go into private sector? Should I go into government? And so I decided, you know, well, the government wanted me to, like, you know, fast track into management and government. And I got a job at EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And I did that for a few years. And I got super frustrated by this huge bureaucracy. And so then I got an internship, like what was supposed to be a 6-month fellowship to go to the International Energy Agency in Paris, because I was working on climate change in the early 90s, like almost even before Al Gore was talking about climate change, I was working on climate. And so I said, well, Washington, D.C. or Paris? I think I'll go to Paris. And unfortunately, the EPA at the last minute didn't approve of this as like a temporary thing. So I basically had to resign from my what would be a federal government career for this like risk of going to Paris for 6 months. Which was not an easy decision, I have to say. And there's sometimes where I'm like, man, if I had just stayed, I could have had a nice pension by now. But anyway, I took the risk. I went to Paris. I had a great time. And so I was working really kind of as the nexus of policy, which basically meant translating all these big scientific ideas of climate and what was going wrong with climate to the government decision makers to talk to them about what policies could they change, what financial incentives did they need, how to address these huge global programs these huge global conflicts in a programmatic, systematic, political, regulatory framework. And so again, in the early 90s, this was all like new. I mean, now, we've been talking about it for 30 years. And the depressing part is we're still talking about the same things I started working on 30 years ago, which is a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem, Julia.
It is a problem. And it is a problem. And to be honest, it's kind of made me burned out. Like it's a very intense topic. And I think it is the most important topic, especially for those of us who have children and are geared towards the future. What kind of planet are we leaving to our kids? We're leaving a planet that, is completely overpolluted. The sea level is rising. The air quality is declining. Public health issues are increasing because the temperatures are increasing, because the diseases are increasing, because, et cetera, et cetera. It's a long, bad spiral, which is depressing.
It is depressing. Yeah,
so, but I was dedicated, perhaps naively, to thinking, okay, I'm just going to spend, 18 hours a day working on this and it's going to change. And yeah, there's small incremental changes, but we're still, unfortunately, not where we should be 25 years later. So basically, I went from International Energy Agency in Paris, working with a nexus, again, between big, like the IEA is basically, to put it in a bit of a derogatory sense, it's the big developed countries oil club, right? So everybody gets together and decides the price of oil, decides future energy prices. And that in itself was a very interesting environment to work with. And then what my role was to basically look at developing countries and say, if we are planting trees in Costa Rica and Norway is trying to figure out how to offset all of the petroleum that it's taking out of the earth, perhaps they could give Costa Rica more money to plant trees, right? So these are the very, very first projects of this time in the mid-'80s called joint implementation, which then got called the Clean Development Mechanism, which now gets called, Sustainable Development. Whatever. Exactly. It's the same thing, the name changes. Okay. So that's what I was working on in the mid-'90s. From there, I went back to California for personal family reasons. I worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a great NGO, again, on climate issues, more California-centric, doing the first climate registry. Then I decided to work for the city of San Francisco, setting up their first climate program. And that was a really hard job. It only lasted a year because city politics, let me tell you, is way more cutthroat and difficult than international politics.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can honestly, I hear you. I don't know why I feel like I knew that already, but
no, I can confirm that. Literally, I worked for the federal government, I worked for international government, I worked for Harvard and academia, I worked for nonprofits, I worked in the business sector, but probably the most frustrating job was that 1 year in San Francisco.
That's funny. Unbelievable.
So then from there, I got so burned out on like the political side of things. I said, screw it, I'm going to the private sector. So I went more to the side of energy efficiency and even more to the side of solar energy. And I worked for a series of solar energy companies. And unfortunately, a lot of those in the 2000s went bust because the Chinese were drastically under pricing and therefore was flooding the market with cheap Chinese solar panels, and so the American companies were going out of business. So that was rough. That was a rough ride. But solar energy is a critical solution to some of these climate problems. And then that brought me to about 12 years ago, where after working for several American companies that went bust, I got offered a position with a German solar company called Phoenix Solar, which then also went bust. But they brought me to Germany, and I said, well, Germany is closer to Italy. And so I started working in Germany as their international head of government and regulatory policy. And then my daughter was actually born in Germany. And shortly after her birth, the company went bankrupt. And
Okay.
so I found myself in Germany, where I don't speak German very well. I don't really like the food. It's the harsher climate, and my father was in Italy. And so I did what like seemed logical to me, which was pack up and move to Italy. Um, so yeah, and at that point I was a single parent, and I thought, the Italians are really good with babies. Like they really like kids. And my father was like, "Are you sure as a single mom you want to live in a Catholic country? Like this is a little crazy." And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. And it's had its definite ups and downs, but I have to say it is a very kid-centric culture. And despite the big bureaucracy, despite the weird Catholicism that for me was a bit has every now and then sort of strikes me in the face as really, despite the fact that it's still a very male dominated, archaic work structure. There's a lot of positive, great things to say about living in Italy.
Yeah. So I want to get back to your daughter and to something you said earlier, which I really liked, which you said that, you basically said the whole reason why you are in Venice is to raise, you've actively made the decision to raise her in Venice. And I want to talk about that. And you said because it's the safest city in the world.
Mm,
And I think, Italy is a country with very few children that is very child-centric, and Venice is almost an extreme of that, right?
yeah,
So,
exactly.
um, so it's a bold choice, but in my eyes, a very logical choice as someone who's raising her child in Italy, not in Venice, but still in
Yeah,
a reality that I feel very comfortable with on a
yeah,
daily basis and that I've been very happy with. So something you can look forward to a few years down the line, about 4 years from now, you'll be in my situation. Um, but I find the choice of Venice fascinating. And so tell me what it is like raising your daughter in Venice.
sure. Well, first, let me back up just to say that at the time that I moved to Italy, my father, before he passed away, was actually living in Florence. So we did
Oh,
spend
okay.
a few years in Florence, and so I still have a lot of friends in Florence. I still have a fond place in my heart for Florence. And maybe I made the wrong decision. Maybe I should have stayed in Florence versus Venice. I think in some ways, as an expat, Florence has got a much bigger community. It's got a lot more education options. It's a quote unquote real city as opposed to Venice, which is really
Right.
actually a very small, provincial, maybe dying city.
Mm.
Um, but I think Venice is a safer place than Florence. I mean,
Oh, for
the
sure.
obvious reasons: you don't have cars. Then you don't have, I think, the crime rate that you have here. I don't think you have, I don't know. I don't need to go into a whole
Right.
Venice versus
Right.
Florence thing, but to say that I love both of them. And we even actually we moved to Rome for 6 months when I got a consultancy at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. So I also brought my daughter to Rome, and she was like 5, and I was bringing her along on an electric bike, and bringing her to the preschool while I went across
Yeah.
and worked at FAO. So I've had a taste of a number of different cities, and Venice is far from perfect, but it's incredible that she, even at age 6, like I could give her money and she could go out and buy pizza and come back at 8 o'clock at night by herself, and I'd have no worries, right? I mean, we live on a small island. Everybody knows everybody. And where else in the world could you do that? Like,
Very few places, if
right?
any. That's
Yeah,
a real gift you've given her. Also,
yeah,
that sense of independence, that sense of
exactly.
serenity, I would actually
Yeah,
say.
yeah.
But so living, I can see all the advantages, but I can also see some of the disadvantages.
Mhm.
So how do you sort of not counter that, but what are some of the difficulties you find?
So the number one difficulty that unfortunately, sadly, in this global economy post-COVID that we live in, the number one difficulty is mass tourism. So this city is every year getting more and more difficult to be a resident and live here with a real job and get from point A to point B if you've got an appointment, because it's flooded with tourists who are walking around like in a state of oblivion, like they're in a museum or in Disneyland, and they don't understand that people actually live here.
I
And
know.
so Florence is, equally as bad, but it's bigger, so maybe you don't feel it as much. Venice is like, you've got these little teeny cale, these little, small
Yeah.
streets.
Yeah.
So it's a problem, and we can talk about that later. But
Yeah.
so yeah, that would be the number one problem. I mean, the second problem is the obvious logistical one, which is, little things like going grocery shopping is
Right.
not easy. Getting to the hospital, not easy. I have to say that I've been very impressed with, generally in Italy, especially compared to 30 years ago, the public transportation in this country is excellent. The boats here run on time. Sometimes they're overcrowded by tourists. And so now they've put in the system where, like, if you're a resident, you should get priority to get on the boat because you have to actually get someplace. It
Exactly.
doesn't always work, but it's nice that they have sort of woken up to that, reality.
Yeah.
But so there's the inconvenience of basic things like, grocery shopping, getting to an appointment. What else is there? What other disadvantages? I, as a Californian, really miss the green. So Venice is completely blue, which is beautiful.
Yeah.
You can't say that there isn't nature because there is the green. I mean, sorry, there is the blue. There is, water everywhere. So you feel like there's this spaciousness, but there's a lot of hidden gardens in Venice, but they're almost all private. So for example, if you have a young kid, there's very few parks or even playgrounds that you can go to in Venice, which is really a problem, right? I think kids need to be outside. I think kids need nature. I think nature is very nourishing, and it takes an effort to, even get to a place that has like 10 trees. So that's not very nice.
No, yeah. And I can imagine that that's not, that's something you feel, especially, you felt especially when your daughter was a little smaller. But because you touched on the tourism question, I do want to, I want to talk, I talk about this a lot on the podcast. And I think one of my main goals is to make people aware when they come to Italy of, our, the impact that we have when we move. We could say the same thing when when I travel to other countries. I try to bring with me the same message that I, send out to the world. So I try to be a conscientious traveler. And Venice, like Florence, is on very much the same path. As you said, it's a little easier because it's a bigger city. It's really a question of maybe just changing your neighborhood, and you can really sort of avoid it. But since we're recording this just about a week after Venice introduced this pilot program of charging sort of an entrance fee, I really am curious to hear your take on that as a resident of the city, because you were talking about, for example, the fact that residents now hypothetically should have preferential boarding and things like that on the traghetti, on the the water buses. But what do you think about this tax? What does the average Venetian think about this this fee?
It's very controversial. So I got interviewed for a magazine, and I basically came out with saying, absolutely, let's tax, and let's tax, for more days, and let's tax for higher money. Now, why do I say this? Because I don't like the mass industrial tourism that Venice has become. I know, I see a lot of people here. I say, where are you staying? Oh, they're staying in Mestre. Or how long are you here for? 12 hours. This is a city that has existed for thousands of years, that is completely unique in the world. There's no other city like this. And to give it, 12 hours doesn't give it justice, right? And so, especially when we had these problems with the cruise ships, which have, luckily the cruise ships no longer pass in front of my 5 windows, but they still come to Venice.
I know.
They still come to Venice, and that's a huge problem. So you asked me what I think of it. I think of it as a good start, and I think that it needs to be enforced, and it needs to be more consistent, and it needs to be more than just, what is it, like 29 days that they have for this year planned out. 29 out of 365, pochissimo, right?
Yeah, it's not very much, no.
But interestingly enough, if you look at, let's see, didn't I take a picture of how much money this is earning? Let me just check. I thought I had looked this up. I'm just reading this Italian. Yeah, okay, ingressi. So the contabilità più, so the city government, of which, by the way, I completely disapprove of, corrupt, badly managed, don't even care about the Venetian residents, but that's another story. The city government said the first 9 days of the experiment, of which there are 29 days planned for the year of 2024, it looked like there was 160,000 ingressi, 160,000 people who paid. Okay, we're talking about in 9 days, right? Okay, which would be 800,000 euros. Okay, it's €5 a person. €5 a person is like 2 coffees.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's nothing. Yeah. So my biggest pet peeve, well, not even a pet peeve, my most fundamental concern is, where does that 800,000 euros go?
That's what I was asking.
Does it do anything to those of us who are residents here? And there's a big punto di domanda. There's a big question mark on that. Accountability in any political system is sketchy. In Italy, it's super sketchy, right? So when I got interviewed for the local paper, I said, look, the only way that residents are going to buy into this tax is if they know that this money is going back into the residents, back into the fact that we pay more money for water and waste than any other city.
Everything.
We pay more money for food. We have, services that are dying. We have like a shortage of doctors. We have a shortage of schools. We have, the basic public works, which of course in Italy, I think work much better than they do in the US right now, if we want to make a comparison. The medical system in Italy, I'm so grateful for the medical system. I've had 8 operations in the last 2.5 years. I had a lot of serious health issues and I paid 0. That's incredible.
I know. It's unbelievable. I know.
But so I'm grateful for the Italian infrastructure as it is. It's not perfect, but going back to the tourist tax, that 800,000, euros that they just got in 9 days is going to evaporate. There's no accountability. We need a democratic system whereby the residents who live in Venice, not in Mestre, not in the big cities,
not on the mainland. I hear you.
Right? The residents in Venice should be able to vote for where that money goes.
Yeah.
Italians are really big on these referendums, right?
I know.
It feels like every 3 or 4 months, Italy has a new election with a new referendum. And I'm like, really? The people get to vote about this? If they get to vote about these little teeny things, why can't they get to vote about the big important things?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the allocation of a tax, which is basically been produced to help make the city more manageable, more livable.
Right.
People who live in the city should be able to help decide where that money goes.
Absolutely.
So that's my biggest concern about it. But I do think it's a start. I think that, again, €5 is nothing. Is €5 really going to prevent somebody from seeing Venice? I don't think so at all.
Not at all. I was just going to say, that's not a deterrent.
That's like a coffee, basically.
You've already flown halfway across the world, most of these people, but even if they haven't, the only thing I could see is maybe Italians not being happy about it.
So I've seen a lot. They've never stopped me yet. I mean, maybe I already look like a local, but I don't think so because I'm 6 feet tall. I've seen a lot of, the quote unquote controllers that wear these, bright vests, stopping people, asking people. So far, I've never seen a tourist or even a local, be kind of hostile about it. I think people are kind of getting okay, yeah, they got to show that they paid, right? Now, if you live here and you have somebody visit you, a family or a friend, then you can exempt them from the tax. Honestly, am I going to take the time to, sign into the website and do blah, 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 blah to get my friend out of €5? No, they should pay the €5, right?
Yeah.
But I believe that the plan of the government is 2024, we'll do it for 29 days. We'll do it for €5. I bet you anything, 2025, we're going to do it for 100 days for €10, et cetera, et cetera. Every year, I think it's going to vamp up, which again goes back to the root question, which is that we need to have both accountability and strong say in where that money goes. We don't want it going to Rome. We don't want going to Mestre. we don't want to go to build a new cruise ship center.
Right.
There are
Right.
basic things in this city that are super underfunded. The schools need more help. The hospitals and the sanitary system needs more help. We pay way too much money for waste and water because the tourists leave their waste everywhere. Like,
Exactly.
as an environmentalist, it just makes my blood boil when I see these people just like dropping their trash on the street. I have to say that Venice, like if you compare it to other cities, the garbage workers who work here, they work hard. It's a weird system. Like somebody comes and rings your bell at 9 a.m. to take your garbage bag because
Really?
you can't leave your garbage outside because the seagulls come and get it. And then
Right.
you walk outside and it's everywhere, right? So it's a weird system, but I see people out there like 6:30, 7 a.m. sweeping the streets.
Yeah.
They make San Marco look clean. They're trying their best, but it's not easy when you have 160,000 tourists come in for a week. That's just unsustainable numbers.
Yeah.
So I think that there's an etiquette that every tourist that travels the world should have. And I think that there's a conscientiousness that cities like Venice or Florence that are really unique in the world need to step back and say, how do we have more sustainable tourism? What do we offer that's unique to us that we can focus on and channel the interest into that, as opposed to people coming here and buying a gelato and getting some piece of glass that's probably made in China and not even made
Probably.
in Milano. Why would they go shopping at the Sephora where you have Sephoras all around the world? Like, let's get away from this mass globalization and let's get back to what makes the city unique, right? Let's get back to the craftsmen. Let's get back
Exactly.
to what do people uniquely make in Venice? What do people uniquely eat in Venice?
Right.
What is how can you enjoy the water other than like paying an expensive gondoliere? What does it mean to live on a lagoon that's a living ecosystem? Like, these are all things that I feel very strongly about, that I feel like tourists should have a greater interest in. And I think that, I have to honestly say that if I said, what am I addicted to? Like, what is my drug of choice personally?
Yeah.
It's travel.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I get it that people want to travel here. I can't say, no, you're not allowed to come to my city because it's not a museum. It's not Disneyland, but I can say, hey, it's not a museum. It's not Disneyland. Treat it with
Exactly.
respect.
Right.
Do your homework. Don't come here for 12 hours. Feel the city. I mean, the city has a very unique energy. Having done my undergrad in New York City, I think there's actually a kind of an interesting comparison between Manhattan and Venice. Like, they're both surrounded by water. Of course, Manhattan has a completely manic energy and Venice has like almost the opposite. Like, things are really slow here.
Yeah.
Because, to get from A to B, there's water, there could be high water, there could be a storm, there could be, it's not the same, right?
Right.
But there's a lot of similarities. They're big international commerce, they're international, there's a lot of art, there's all sorts of similarities between Manhattan and Venice. But that aside, the point is, I'm supportive of the tax. I think it has to be very carefully monitored as to where that money goes. And I think generally, Italy as a whole, which is a country that relies, I don't know, I think like 70 or 80% of the economy of Italy is now tourism.
Yeah.
Italy needs to step back and say, okay, we want to maintain this great influx of money and tourism, but how do we do that in a sustainable way?
Exactly.
And I think I don't even think that's the job of anybody in Rome, but it should be. The Ministero di Turismo this should be like number one priority.
Yeah, I agree. And it's actually what I'm really glad that you're speaking about it, and you're speaking about it from this really informed point of view, because I speak about it all the time, just sort of as like an observer of culture. And so somebody who wants to do exactly what you just said, it's our responsibility to approach travel wherever we go in the world with humility, with respect, you know, and Venice is a really extreme example, but it's certainly not the only one in the world. And so it's a question of making people more aware of the fact that there is a way to travel in an alternative fashion. There is a way to travel without sort of being a destructive simple tourist. And so what you said about sort of doing your homework, that's exactly what I try to do with the podcast. So people do know, and hearing from you. So not only are you a resident, but you're also an expert. These are the things that you've studied and that you've worked on for years. And so I think your point of view is fundamental. And I love what you said about tourists coming in. I mean, how many people really think about that when they're in Venice? We are in, the midst of this immense lagoon. It's a living, incredible, complicated organism. And then you put upon that centuries of history, centuries of art with all the logistical challenges that a city like Venice poses, right? If you only spend 12 hours in Venice, you don't understand that.
No.
And I think just listening to this conversation gives people so much more of an understanding of what it means to live in a city like that, what's involved in cleaning up after the amount of people go through a city like that, how you can preserve a city like that. And I love what you said about Venice and sort of looking at it. Venice is a fascinating city because it does have all this art and it does have this incredible energy, this creative energy, this unbelievable international history, all of the East-West, contaminations, all of this, it's a really magical place to be in, but it isn't Disney World. And so that's bothered me, because I'm also, by the way, in favor of the tax. When I go to New York, if I stay in a hotel, I pay a city tax.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the same thing. I'm sorry, I don't see any difference. I know that you also pay the room tax and stuff, but when you go and stay in a hotel, pretty much in any city that I've stayed in, you get a whole nice little, string
Yes,
of
there's always
costs,
excess.
right? So,
Yeah.
I think if we are going to travel responsibly, and if I know that my €5 is going to help somehow, right, then I'm going to happily pay it. And thank goodness there are people who are really seriously worried about sustainable tourism in Italy. I don't know what the government is doing about it, because I'm trying my best to make people come in a more sustainable way. But even like the other day, I had posted an interview that I did on a podcast about my recommendations. When my clients ask me how to travel, I say spend as much time as possible in one place if you can, or, limit your travel. And a couple of people, called me out on it, saying, oh, the average US citizen doesn't have that much time. I understand that. And I understand the desire to do, Rome, Venice, Florence, Milan, the Amalfi Coast, but you're not going to absorb anything,
Yeah,
and
I
you're also
mean,
going to do a lot
even
of damage.
exactly. So, I mean, I'm sorry that the US is the way it is, that you have, the average person has 2 weeks of vacation a year. I mean, first of all, that's just, inhumane. But
Right.
you have 2 weeks a year and you want to come to Italy, don't do all those places. I
Right.
can't tell you how many, especially, young kids. It's like they have this bucket list. Oh, I
I
went here,
know.
there, and I went
Oh,
there.
I know.
But do you remember any of that? Like, you just click a zillion photos on your cell phone. You probably don't even look at them. And you probably end up in an Irish pub drinking beer that you could do at home. So
Right. And that's the other problem too. I think that, the post-pandemic, the ease with which we see so many, for example, people see tourists in Venice, and whether they're doing dumb things or whether they're doing good things, people are seeing those things and so many times, and so many TikToks and so many Instagram reels and so many
yeah,
whatever,
yeah,
that then, people, that's it. It's on, as you said, their bucket list. So you have to do, your obligatory stops in all these places. And the fact of the matter is, there are places that are totally ignored.
yeah.
And that's what's so sad too, even if you think even just of the Veneto, which is so rich, we were just talking about Palladio a minute ago. There are places, I'm not saying to miss Venice, it's hard to miss, you have to go, like everyone
Yeah,
should go
but
to
go to
Venice.
Vicenza or go
Right.
to Asolo or go to
Exactly.
Treviso, or I mean, there's,
Right.
I, I'm a big one for, yeah, I agree with you that it's nice to stay put in one place, because then you actually start to get the feeling of what it is to be in
Yeah.
a place. But I also think that if you're going to come to Venice, as I said, do your homework and try not to do the same 10 things that you think you're supposed to do. Like, you know, I feel really strongly about that. And I also feel strongly about going back to the city tax. You know, we have invested, I even think maybe $1 trillion, several $billion on building this mose, this dam.
I know. I visited it. I
Right?
visited.
I'm glad you visited it. And it's very controversial, right? Like the Dutch came down and said, look, this is how you do it. We've saved our country. And, you know, 3 days later, the Italians are like, get out of here. You know, we want to build the Ferrari. We want to build something that's underwater and super sleek and sexy. And oh, by the way, it costs so much that we don't know how to put it up very often. I mean, come on. So why don't we use the tourist tax to make sure that we can put up the mose more often? You know, there's I mean, you as, you know, as a resident of Florence, you know, the 66 flags were huge. Well, let me tell you that I couldn't walk out my front door, you know, 5 years ago because the water was above my waist.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, I've worked on climate change for 25 years. I knew that the sea level was rising. I never, ever thought it would happen in such a short period of time in my life, right? So all of these things that all of these catastrophic things that we think are going to happen, like by the time our grandchildren are born, are actually happening now. Okay. So that's the first like red light, but it doesn't mean that we can't change it. But I think that for me, what's interesting living in Venice is that it is really very much of a microcosm of what's going on in the world. Like you're so in touch with the weather here, being surrounded by water. You know, if you've got wind coming from here or there, you've got extreme heat. You've got, I mean, even in the last 3 days in Venice, yesterday it was like winter. Today it's like summer. You know, the poor plants are totally confused.
Same here. Same here.
It's really a problem. And so, you know, we've got this massive industrial, you know, village. Well, it's not a village. It's basically an industrial park of Marghera, which was built, you know, in the 20s and 30s. Yes, it was right after, you know, the World War I, World War II. Italy was, you know, had terrible depression. They didn't have jobs. So, you know, these visionaries, these Venetian visionaries said, all right, well, let's build, you know, an industrial hub. Now, why on earth they decided to build it right next to the world's most beautiful city, I still don't understand. So we've got major air pollution problems, which when I first moved here, I had no idea. Like I thought, all right, there's no cars. That's great. There's going to be, you know, the air quality is going to be. No, clean air, no. And this is something that's not talked about because we have 2 air monitors in the entire city, which is ridiculous.
That's
right?
it?
That's it. So they basically, the authorities that be don't want people to know how bad the air quality is. Now, the Veneto is particular in the way that the Adriatic and the wind comes from the Adriatic, and the humidity and the geography of the Veneto is particular in that it's kind of like Milan, which is that the pollution kind of stays there a little bit like Los Angeles. You know, you've got all these big mountains and the
cloud
stays there.
Right.
I didn't know that when I first moved to Venice. I didn't know that the air quality is as bad as it is. I mean, I'm very lucky. I don't have like terrible allergies. I have good lungs. You know, I teach yoga. My lungs are strong. I'm all about breathing, but I didn't know I was breathing such unhealthy air. And why don't we do something about this? Because the air pollution is also ruining the art. You know, we've got these Palladio churches, you know, that literally have to be restored, you know, every 5 years because we have so many water taxis that have terrible engines. Even the water buses are still diesel. Then we've got this industrial park of Marghera. So we've got a lot of pollution that are coming both from the boats, the cruise ships, the taxis, the buses. Then we've got this industrial park of Marghera where you have Eni saying that it's converted to biofuels, but that's basically greenwashing because they're not really doing biofuels there. And if they are, they're taking it from Indonesia and not from, you know, the cooking oil of the calamari. So there's a lot of complex environmental issues that are going on in Venice, which is interesting as an environmentalist. It's a bit depressing, but I think that Venice, as I said, is a really interesting microcosm for the rest of the world. As I said, you know, the sea level rise is happening. It's visual. I see it. We never used to have high water in the summer, and now we're having it. We get a lot more waves that we've never had. We get these extreme storms that within 5 minutes, the entire, sky
Wow.
goes from beautiful blue to
Right.
literally black.
Yeah.
These are all unpredictable things that make, living here difficult, but, it's risky. It's risky living, in Florida too. I'm not
Yeah,
saying,
I would actually say right now, given the current state of things, you pretty much every day you hear some other,
yeah,
disaster, natural disaster, other. I think what you say about Venice being a microcosm is so interesting because I think what you're dealing with is you see it in such a, you're really in it. I'm in it in Florence in a very different way because
yeah,
you're so much more in touch with the elements,
yeah,
just the water itself. And then also the tourism here is already extreme. It's May, we're recording this now, but I live in a neighborhood, I talk about this a lot, where it just takes me about 10 minutes and I'm away from everyone, but it slows me down and it drives me
sure,
crazy. And I have missed trains in Venice. I have missed
yeah,
trains in Venice many a time. And I'm not talking
yeah,
about this year. I'm talking about when the
right,
numbers, I'm not talking about these
lower,
pandemic numbers.
yeah.
So I think you raise a whole lot of interesting points. And I want, as we sort of move towards the end of our conversation, I want to talk about, because I find first of all, I'm very grateful to you for coming and sharing such an interesting insider read of what living in Venice is really like, and for raising all of these really crucial questions, because I do hope that people who come to Venice have an awareness of this. I mean, at the very least, and everything you just mentioned will not, that tourist tax will not even, it's not even a drop in the bucket. It's not even a drop in the bucket. And
Yeah.
so I think your predictions are spot on. And I think that people who are living in Venice actually could end up being the best sort of poster people for a more sustainable tourism in general. I mean, you already are, but in general in Italy, but then in the world even on a grander scale. So
I mean,
yeah, sorry, go on.
if I can raise one more
One
regulatory
more.
tourism
Yeah.
problem that we have, which is, Venice is not at all the only city that has this in any way, shape, or form, but we've got a huge problem now with housing and with Airbnbs.
Oh,
So
yeah.
as a property owner in Venice, you have a choice. You could, rent to students who will pay you like 500 euros a month, or you could decide to turn your, extra apartment into an Airbnb and get, 150, 200 euros a night, right?
Exactly.
So it's a pretty obvious economic choice for a lot of people, which is a huge problem for this city.
I,
So first of all, we have four great universities in Venice. So we've got a really interesting, dynamic, fun student population. And these poor students, they can't find a place to live, or even if they
terrible.
stay in dorms, like, end of May, those dorms, they close, they turn into Airbnbs, right? The university is now turning all the dorms into Airbnbs. So you come here for a summer session, forget about it. Like, it's basically impossible to find an affordable room. The reason I bring this up is because governments can regulate Airbnbs, and what the government needs to do for a place in Venice is, first of all, basically rearrange the priorities of the economy. So you've got a lot of super smart young people that are graduating from university in Italy, and they're not finding jobs.
Yeah.
They're not finding jobs in the great, yes, it's difficult to find a job if you
Okay.
go in for, art history or philosophy. There's not that many jobs out there, but basically we have college grads and even, graduate students from PhD programs who end up getting jobs as like check-in, check-outs for Airbnb.
Yeah. I know.
That's just wrong.
I know.
And I think that the city needs to incentivize property owners to have people there on a longer term. We should have quotas, how many Airbnbs are allowed. We should have much better controls. We should basically switch the economy so that we're not 80% focused on tourism.
Yeah.
Post-COVID, people have woken up to like this life-work balance, which is great. They've woken up to the fact that they should, take better care of their bodies. They should spend more time with their families. From my perspective, that's what makes Italy a great place, is that it allows you to do both of those things. A lot of Americans don't even have that option because it's not in the American mindset. but it will only happen if a city like Venice decides to incentivize companies to come to Venice, to start businesses here, to have incubators here, to do startups here, to let people be digital nomads here. You know, I mean, it's a great place to live, but if the economy maintains this idea of mass tourism is the only way we can make money, then we're all screwed. Like, really, it's not a nice place to live. It's not a fun place to be a tourist. You know, you're not actually making money because they're buying junk. They're eating junk. So I'm obviously a big pro of sustainable tourism, but I'm also a big pro that the government has to make a conscious choice to control both this Airbnb problem, but also to control how they incentivize jobs to happen. So we need to have less tourism jobs and more quote unquote real jobs. And those could be, I mean, there are companies that are kind of waking up and, you know, buying places and turning them into incubators, or turning them into medical research centers, or turning them into, you know, art restoration places, or, you know, there's all sorts of opportunities. And I think if you're an American, you have much more of an entrepreneurial spirit, and you kind of think about, oh, let's do this or let's do that. It's not really in the Italian mentality. They kind of look at you like, what? Why would you do something so different that's so difficult? Which is, you know, that's a mentality thing. But I do think it's a government policy that needs to be addressed more, of how do you switch the economy from being so predominantly tourist based to incentivizing to have better paid, more sustainable, more interesting jobs, so that the population who lives there doesn't all migrate to Mestre or migrate out of Venice because they can't afford to live in Venice.
And maybe actually incentivize people to actually return to Venice, you know, and to families. And, you know, one of the reasons why I left the downtown, I was living right in the downtown area of Florence for quite a long time. And it became, I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't drive around for an hour every Saturday night looking for parking. I couldn't
It
stand.
just raises your stress.
And but nobody was like paying any attention, you know, and it was kind of, I wanted to be like, hey, look, I'm here and I'm like keeping the downtown alive, and I have a child, and I'm like, you know, supporting local business. Like, you should be at least guaranteeing me a parking space. You know what I mean? And so, you know, it became, and I think though you raise a lot of really crucial points. We're having a very terrible situation here in Florence. It's analogous to Venice. Families are not able to rent, families. Okay. And there have been moves on the part of city government to limit Airbnbs, et cetera. But I mean, you know, when a normal family can no longer afford to live in a city, this is a problem. When students can no longer afford to live in city, I've heard there have been cases in the news of students who have to like leave on the weekends to empty out like Airbnb like situations. This is where are we? What is this? What is
What
this?
is this? I know, it's very inhumane.
You know, it's
And I have to say, a special aspect of Venice as a resident is that because I have to walk everywhere, you know, I have a human interaction with people that if you're driving, you don't have, right? People have eye contact, they say hello, they know my face, maybe they don't know my name, or many of them know my name and I don't know their name, right? But you have this human interaction, which I think is critical. I mean, this is completely off topic, but the blue zones of talking about, like, where in the world do you get to be 100 years and healthy, right? What are the critical points of growing old and healthy and happy? One is socialization, two is exercise, three is diet. Venice has all of those things, right? You have a great Mediterranean diet. You have to walk everywhere, so you have to exercise. And you have this basically built-in social network because you see people and you have this human, you know, face-to-face relationship, but you're not on your phone all the time. You're not like in your car all the time. There's a real human element. And I think as a tourist, if you come here for more than 12 hours and you've done your homework and you're open to like, what is it like to live in the city? I think Venetians are actually very friendly to tourists if they're friendly back, right? If you go to a restaurant and you're not just like there with your kid who's on their, you know, tablet because you don't want to have a conversation with your kid, and you order a frozen pizza, then, you know, of course they're not going to interact with you. But generally, you go in there, you talk to the waiters, or you talk to the, you know, people at the supermarket, you know, and you ask them things about what is it like to live in Venice. People are really open, right? They're not totally jaded. they're jaded for these tourists that come in these massive groups and just like want two things and want to pay, nothing for them and leave.
No, but
Leave
that's
their
just too much. It's
leave
not
their
sustainable
plastic,
for, yeah.
their plastic
Right.
everywhere. So
That's not sustainable for anyone, and I think even that's bothersome to fellow tourists as well. And
and
so,
I
or to
think
fellow
as a
travelers.
tourist, I wouldn't want to go to a town which basically had no residents and just had people serving me.
Neither
Like
would I.
there's no soul,
Yeah,
right? The
exactly.
soul of a city is the people who live there. And
Right.
so if the government is not supporting the soul of a city, they're losing its most important asset, which is a
Yeah.
completely unique city in the world.
Right.
So the politicians have to wake up, but even the people who own businesses here have to realize that they have to have a certain attitude. They have to remain their authentic Venetian selves. We
Yeah.
have to promote not this not McDonald's or Hard Rock Cafe. We have to what is Venetian, and and how can we foster that? How can we foster more residents move here? I mean, in the 10 years that I've lived here, every year the population of actual registered residents in Venice goes down somewhere
I
between
know.
800 to 1,500 people a year. So that puts us at 200 years ago, this city used to have I don't know, 300,000 or 400,000 residents. And now we're maybe 40, 45. I don't know. I'm not very good at remembering numbers, even though I have
That's okay. But it's gone down
but
significantly.
basically it's huge.
Yeah.
Like the drain of residents every year is going down because it's becoming more expensive, because there are less jobs, because the infrastructure is not great. But that said, why do I live here? Because it's great for my daughter, because it's an incredibly unique, beautiful city. It's full of all sorts of treasures. I mean, when I go on my walks every day, if I'm paying attention, I can still see something that I've never seen before.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. I mean, it happens to me in Florence. Venice, I still get lost in after, frequenting it for many, many years. So we didn't have, so we had a great conversation about so many things. We didn't get to talk about the other things that you do now. So I wanted to give you a chance, at least in the last couple of minutes of the podcast, in addition to all your work as an environmentalist and your consulting work and all of the passion you have for Venice and for saving La Serenissima. I also wanted to hear share with our listeners all the other amazing stuff you do.
Okay. Well, so when you come to Venice, you should look at yogavenezia.com. So that's my little plug. This is my little commercial moment. Okay. I've been talking for over an hour and I forgot to do my commercial moment.
We'll put it in the show notes. We'll put it, you mentioned yoga. You did mention yoga. And
so I teach yoga. I've been teaching yoga for almost 20 years. And I teach it in a way that is also connected to the city, right? So there's a lot of yoga poses that are about, bridges and boats and water. And so I like to bring in the story of Venice into the yoga that I do. I'm also have an art history background. So I like even to do sort of yoga art tours where we, do fitness stuff. We walk or run to some unique church or point, and I talk about that. And then we do some yoga. And so
I love that, by the way.
Yeah. So basically, yoga is not as big in Italy as it is in basically any other country I've lived in, which is unfortunate. It's unfortunate that I meet a lot of Italians who are Catholic who are like, yoga? I can't do yoga. That's Hindu. That goes against my Catholic belief. And I'm like, what? But people have their ideas. I mean, to me, yoga is about oneness, connectedness, that we are all the same, that it's part of the universe, which is very much, like an essence that you have to pay attention to when you're in Venice, right? The nature and the elements, if you're not part of it, you're going to get washed away by a big wave.
Yeah.
So I'm yogavenezia.com. I love teaching yoga. I love, talking about my personal knowledge of art history and environmental issues in Venice. And I also like helping people. A lot of people randomly contact me, on social media, and they're like, I'm thinking about coming to Venice to do a sabbatical on this, or I'm thinking about moving to Venice with my child. What's it like for the school system? And, right now I probably spend too much free time helping other people because I feel like, okay, well, nobody really helped me figure it out. And it is a complicated move. It is a risky move. So I like, I could probably get some business tips on you as to how to turn that into an actual business. But I think it is important, and I think it'll be really interesting. I mean, God forbid that the horrific man who should not be named gets reelected in November. If he does, there's going to be a mass migration exodus out of the U.S.
I know.
I already have friends who are contacting me like, how do you do it? How do I, and we haven't touched on the issue of immigration, but that is going to be, it's very related to climate change, and it's going to be the biggest problem in the next 20 years. I mean,
Absolutely.
as an American, I already see every year the Italian government asks me for an additional document that they didn't ask me for the year before. It's getting harder and harder to be here, right? Because there's less and less jobs, because every government all around the world is being protectionist, not wanting to realize that, migration is a normal thing, right?
Yeah, but also with climate change, those flows are just going to keep increasing. The world is getting hotter. It's not livable anymore. It's not going to be livable, right?
No. We're lucky in Venice that we have a beach. I mean, in 12 minutes, I can take a boat and, walk, and I'm on the beach at the Lido, which is fantastic. In 10 years, will I be able to swim in that water? I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
I don't know. Well, I never like to end on a negative note. So I think the best way to end is that I would like to, I hope to invite you back maybe after we've seen how this pilot program that Venice is running. Maybe you'll come back in 6 months or so. We'll see if your predictions came true. And ideally, I'd love to actually come up to Venice and do a sort of a yoga / I don't want to run. I'll walk fast, and
I'm not a big runner either, especially on these. Venice is a lot of stones. So anybody who does come to Venice, tourists, beware, take note. These are hard stones. These stones have been around for hundreds of years.
And they can be slippery.
Yes, they can be slippery. It's really bad for your feet. So yeah, I'm not a big proponent of running.
Okay.
I'd be happy to do some yoga and show you around and
yeah. And I love the idea of doing this really sort of very intentional, ecological visit to Venice. So very much I love what you said about, the ecosystem. I'm going back to that because I love the idea of visiting Venice with that very much on our minds, because I don't think a lot of people think about that, Julia. So thank you for everything you said today. Thank you. This should be mandatory listening for anyone who's thinking about a trip to Venice, and also in light of this, this controversial move on the part of the city, which I think we're going to see becoming much more common all over the world. All over the world. And it's just a question of, I mean, everything's become more expensive. Everything, the numbers are what they are. We're not looking, you and I, you've been here for over 10 years, but you've had a relationship with Italy your whole life. I've been here for over 25 years. The change just in the last couple of years has been huge. It's huge. And so there needs to be, people need to be stepping up. And so I'm grateful to you for being one of those people who's fighting the good fight. And I hope you will come back on the podcast, and we'll talk about what things look like in the next couple of months. Grazie mille.
There you go, Fausta. Thank you so much. It's been fun. And
alla prossima volta.
I hope you come to Venice, but only in a sustainable way.
Oh, I will. I'll come in a sustainable way.
I meant like you, as in generally your listeners.
Yes, and my listeners. Yes, we will. And I promise you that. Grazie ancora.
Okay, grazie.
Ciao.